Okay, thank you everyone for joining today's UXPA webinar. We are joined here by Sam Evans, and he's going to be presenting today on managing researcher risk, well-being, and emotional safety while in the field. Please visit our website, uxpa.org, for future short courses and webinars. Coming up on Friday, we have a UXPA book club discussion with Jenny Davis. So if you were able to tune into Jenny's webinar last month, hopefully you purchased her book, and so you'll be able to have a discussion with her regarding her book this upcoming Friday. In December, we have the basics and best practices of writing for chatbots, followed by our short course, which will be led by Charlie Preitzberg, and it'll be on writing for the web. So without further ado, I am going to hand it on over to Sam and let him get into our webinar for today. Please be mindful that this is recorded. This recording will be made available to you guys within 72 hours. And again, continue to check our website for updates, webinars, and short courses. Go ahead, Sam.
All right, thank you so much. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. All right, great. So thank you all so much for joining me and tuning in. Happy Veterans Day. As was just mentioned, my name is Sam Evans, and I work for a company called Forest Marsh Group as a senior researcher in qualitative methods. And I want to spend some time today talking about this topic. It's very important to me, well-being for researchers and emotional safety while in the field. Today, my goal is to start or hopefully continue a conversation about moderator and researcher safety in the field. I'm going to start by talking about what I mean by researcher risk, providing examples from what I've experienced and what I've seen in the field. And then I'll talk through some barriers that keep us from acting in our own self-interest during data collection. And then finally, I'll talk through some steps that I and my team have come up with to mitigate and help manage these situations beforehand, but also in the moment. And at the end, we'll have a chance for Q&A. So let's jump into defining risk. Typically, some of the first things that might come to mind most likely are risks in the field for scope, schedule, and budget of our projects. There's a lot going on and a lot to think about to ensure that a study and each session runs smoothly in order to get our quality data. Did I bring everything? Will participants show up on time? Is my internet stable? Is my participants' internet stable? So all these factors that we have to think about that are risks for our data collection. But I want to underscore that those are risks for the data and not necessarily for the researchers themselves. And what I want to focus on are these bottom two items here, the physical and emotional risks that we take just by the mere nature of being in the field. And these are more personal, obviously. So questions like, what do you do if a participant makes an offensive or derogatory remark during a focus group? How do you handle a participant who makes a pass at you during an interview? And what if a participant threatens you over an incentive or scheduling decision? As qualitative researchers, one of our primary roles is mitigating risks that are faced by our participants. And oftentimes we forget to consider these bottom items and the personal risks that face us. Interpersonal interactions with people in general are the lifeblood of our work. And sometimes that puts us in uncomfortable or even potentially threatening situations. And much like in the real world, interactions in the research environment can be unpredictable. And I want to preface this pretty heavily by saying that most conversations that you're going to have with participants are going to be perfectly pleasant. And this conversation isn't meant to be alarmist, but as researchers, we need to plan for the most challenging and the most unpredictable situations before we get into them. So as I mentioned, I want to quickly highlight some examples of risks that we face with regard to physical well-being. These risks can take many forms, such as threats of violence, acts of violence, sexual assault, or even exposure to illnesses. And that last one there is the primary reason we're all operating data collection entirely remotely at this point. Earlier this year, our whole industry was grappling with what to do as at the time, a global health crisis was escalating throughout Europe and Asia. And we're asking questions like, is it still safe for our participants, our clients, and our researchers to be partaking in in-person data collection? And eventually, as we learned more and cases spread and COVID-19 was named a pandemic, the answer was obviously no. And we shifted to meet that need and shifted either to the online space or canceled some of our studies that we had in place. Physical well-being will reemerge as a priority in other regards as we tiptoe back into face-to-face interactions as we hopefully get a better handle on the COVID-19 pandemic. Researchers at my company just before the pandemic, interacted with participants in certain threatening situations that I anticipate may come back to light once we're back in person. And these included heated disputes from participants over incentives, some racist language during interviews, and flirtatious or advances from participants during an interview. And while fortunately none of these instances escalated to actual physical contact, the threat and the fear of it were present. And in these moments, our moderators and our research staff were forced out of their research roles and into these tense situations that required de-escalation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. First, I also want to highlight some examples of risks to emotional well-being. And you'll notice that in some cases, these are interrelated with those on the previous slide, because some of the physical risks that we discussed will have emotional impacts on us. And these risks include verbal abuse, sexually inappropriate language, and discriminatory or otherwise offensive language or behavior. And the effects of emotional risks or these situations can be a little bit longer lasting than physical. Something to keep in mind is that the use of derogatory language could come in the guise of an on-topic remark from a participant. For example, I was once conducting a group on sexual harassment and assault when one of my participants brought up PC culture and complained to me about no longer being able to use derogatory terms for gay men in jest with his friends as a form of male bonding. And as a gay man who grew up as the target of such language, that was a really challenging conversation for me to lead, especially without warning. For a moment, I was abruptly taken out of my professionalism and my that conversation. I'd forgotten what question I had asked and how we got there, let alone what question I was supposed to be asking. So it took me a moment to grapple with that. Some of my past experiences were brought up, and I had to sort of push those aside and redirect the conversation. And I think things like this happen because as moderators, as qualitative researchers, a big part of the work is making sure our participants feel comfortable opening up to us. And in some instances, that can lead to more challenging conversations than we had bargained for. Perhaps we've done too good of a job making our participants feel comfortable. I also want to note that specifically for this instance, emotional risks are heightened when a topic at hand is sensitive in nature. So for example, substance abuse or sexual harassment and assault and suicide prevention. These conversations are generally just more challenging and emotions can run high in these sessions. And sometimes participant experiences may even echo experiences that you've had, which can make the conversation feel a bit more personal and can more easily bring you out of the conversation as a researcher and into the conversation as a human. And this could also be stressful for you as a researcher long after the session has ended, depending on your past experiences and how similar the experiences that are being discussed or the topic that's come up is to your past experiences, and could take the form even in drastic situations as traumatic stress. I also want to take a little bit of time just to note that events outside of your research study will impact both you and your participants as well. Thinking specifically of this year alone, this could include climate-related events, health-related events, police brutality, and a spotlight on systemic racism, and particularly contentious politics. These topics may not be a part of your intended conversation. However, if they're happening in a salient way at the local or even national level, they may be top of mind for you and your participants in the room. So they might come up either before the study or during the conversation. And as researchers, we'll need to be prepared to handle that conversation as well, either before the session or during. If before, it might be necessary to reset the tone at the beginning of your session, just to make sure that the conversation isn't focused too much on current events, if that's not the goal of the study. You may also decide, if the conversation comes up during your study, that current events are relevant, and you may need to adjust in the moment to meet that need, or decide to redirect. All right, so now I've talked through some personal risks that researchers face in the field. I want to touch on some of the barriers or reasons that might prevent us from acting in these certain situations. But first, I'd like to ask you to hop into the chat and quickly throw out a few reasons that you might not take action in some of the instances that I mentioned just now. What are some reasons that you might hesitate? Any thoughts on reasons you might hesitate if you were faced with a more challenging fear of unpredictable response? Yes, definitely. Fear of escalation. I think fear is a big factor here, and not being prepared for that conversation. Like what I was just mentioning with my experience, I was not prepared to have that conversation. Potentially biasing the study results. Yes. Adding in a new conversation that you hadn't planned for, or impacting what you do if you need to remove a participant and how that impacts your study. That's definitely something to think about. And power imbalance, because you need something from the participant. Definitely something to think about as well. Thank you all for throwing those out there. Yeah, so as we're just talking about, our interactions with participants are unbalanced. In these situations, we're not acting on our own behalf, but rather on behalf of the study, our employer, and our client. This means that each decision that we make has an impact outside of ourselves, whether it's on the study budget, the deadline, as we were just mentioning, on the study itself, or even client relationships. And these factors tend to outweigh other factors, such as our own well-being, as we decide how to respond. But also, I do want to note that as qualitative researchers, part of our goal is to remain objective and removed from the conversation personally. And that can impact how we respond. I know for me, I go into what I call researcher mode, and I put up sort of a wall where I remove myself to help maintain that objective observation. And sometimes you're forced out of that. But as a result of all these factors, social lines that we would normally draw with strangers can shift in the name of data collection. So we might end up enduring behavior or language that we would otherwise deem unacceptable. And if the situation I mentioned earlier had happened to me outside of work, I probably would have responded differently. I likely would have taken that time to turn it into perhaps a teachable moment. But teaching isn't my role as a moderator. And as one of our participants mentioned, it could also impact the study. And at that point, we were well off topic. So instead, I took a deep breath. I decided that I could push that aside and deal with it later. I acknowledged that the participant had responded at all. And then I redirected the conversation back to the topic at hand. These factors, budget, deadline, client needs, they play a role in how we approach health events as well. Thinking back to the initial spread of COVID-19, many of us already had travel already booked or studies underway, and acting in the interest of our own health and indeed the health of our participants had implications for all of these factors. And all of that being said, each of us has our own personal line that can't be crossed. So where do we draw that line between enduring for the data and protecting ourselves? When is it okay to put your needs above the research? In asking myself those exact questions, given some of the circumstances that I had found myself in, I've come up with 7 steps to managing these risks and thinking them through. And this has worked well for myself and my team, and just safeguarding ourselves in the field when we find ourselves in these types of situations. The first step is introspection. So I encourage everyone to take time and space to define your personal boundaries with regard to both physical and emotional well-being. Doing so will help you make decisions about the type and amount of work that you pursue. Asking yourself questions, for example, like, how comfortable are you traveling during a health event like the seasonal flu, something that might happen more regularly? How might immersion in a more sensitive topic impact you personally? How might your own political views impact your ability to remain objective and impartial during certain types of discussions? What is your capacity for handling current events or unpleasant interactions that might find their way into your conversations? And are you prepared to absorb and redirect potentially offensive language or behavior? Asking these questions up front will better prepare you for navigating more challenging conversations during data collection. Just knowing your boundaries and acknowledging when something will be a challenge will help you plan and set yourself up for success. So this process and indeed the boundaries themselves will look different for every person. And they're going to look different within yourself over time as you gain experience and depending on what's happening in your life. So there might be times where you have a lot going on and you don't have as much capacity to handle these more sensitive and challenging conversations. And then there might be other times where you do have that capacity. And that'll be on you just to make sure that you're checking in with yourself to make sure you know where you are. And that's not to say that you shouldn't challenge yourself. There will be times where you have conversations ahead of you or topics that you can pursue that you know will be challenging for you. I would encourage you to take those challenges. Just make sure that you're not also sacrificing then your emotional well-being and making those calculated challenges. And as I was just saying, pay attention to yourself and check in with yourself, particularly during data collection for more sensitive topics. I would work in a self-check-in to the data collection schedule, maybe even set a calendar invite or a reminder just to make sure that you're taking space for yourself to check in on how that study topic itself is impacting you and the conversations. Because with things like substance abuse or sexual harassment and assault, those can be very heavy conversations, and you may need to take space to just regroup afterwards. I would also suggest, along the lines of introspecting, thinking through setting broader guidelines for yourself to give yourself permission to take action, but also to allow yourself the flexibility to act within a sort of framework. And what I mean by that, as an example, is you might decide that you're generally comfortable pushing past or ignoring sexist remarks during a session. You can generally push them aside without them having an impact on you personally, because you deal with them outside of work or for whatever reason. In an IDI, you might just be able to move on and continue with the conversation. However, in a focus group setting, you might notice that same remark, has a different impact on you, but also the other participants in the room. And ultimately, you might decide that even though it's the same type of remark, it's a different situation. So you might need to, you might decide that conversation is too disruptive for the group as a whole, and you need to take some action. So just a quick example of how you might set a general framework that you can then adapt to each situation. The second step is to empower action through policy. This is especially important for larger organizations where decision-making power rests perhaps higher up, and more junior staff who are in the field may not feel full autonomy to make certain decisions that, as we discussed earlier, could impact the study, could impact the cost of the study, or could even impact client relationships. At our organization, we identified this as a potential barrier for our researchers protecting themselves. just not fully knowing how you're allowed to respond to something like this in the field can prevent you from acting at all. In one instance, one of our more junior moderators was being hit on by one of our participants. And fortunately, I was in the back room and we were in contact via live chat. And we were able to sort of make some decisions together in the moment. And she ultimately decided that she was comfortable pressing forward and she got the session back on track. But that's not something a scenario we had talked through beforehand. And it's not something that either of us was really prepared to happen. And as we debriefed, we chatted about some of the pressures that she felt to continue the study, including the costs, the client satisfaction, and just generally being surprised and thrown off that this was happening to her while she was at work. So as a result of that conversation, among others, we took some steps as an organization just to ensure that we had a clear policy in place that encourages our researchers to act accordingly to their best judgment. And this may seem small, but having an explicit and documented policy can empower employees and removes corporate pressure on researchers to stay in potentially threatening situations. Had that situation I just mentioned escalated any further, I would have stepped in and ended it, but hopefully our researcher would have felt empowered to end it as well, since the actions of the participant were disruptive and were no longer productive for the conversation, but also were threatening for her personally. And within our policy, we not only gave permission, so to speak, to act, we laid out some situations like the ones I just walked through that might warrant action, and then some guidelines for how to act, and for our researchers to follow in order to either dismiss a participant or perhaps flag a disruptive participant from future research. Knowing that you can do something and knowing what to do and having options and permission to do it will help remove any uncertainty and will make it less intimidating to make some of these decisions in the moment if you need to. And it'll help you act a little bit more quickly. Excuse me. So if your company hasn't talked about this or hasn't taken this into consideration, I urge you to start that conversation, because this could be as simple as just defining who has the authority to end a session and what are some potential reasons. This is especially important if you're a more junior researcher in the organization. I would suggest that you bring this up to your employer and set a plan in place, because it's never too early to talk about this. And this step is also appropriate for health-related events as well, such as seasonal outbreaks and our current COVID-19 situation. Looking forward to our transition back to in-person data collection, we're going to want to have some firm guidance in place for both our researchers and participants to follow in order to protect their well-being. And this can include sanitation protocol between sessions, guidelines for the appropriate number of staff and participants on site, and even what researchers should do in the event of COVID-19 resurgence, if that should happen. Step 3 builds upon step 2 in that team, excuse me, team level guidelines are easier to set when you have a larger policy in place. And these can be more specific and targeted to your study or the study at hand. When you start a project, allow yourself and other researchers the time to think through basically what might go wrong or what types of conversations might happen, especially if you're going to be having difficult conversations. As appropriate, talk through these scenarios, think through what you should do as a team. This could be during a kickoff meeting or even as a separate brainstorming session. Coming to a consensus as a team on how to handle these situations will create a network of support that will help your team on the ground make those de-escalation decisions it'll make those decisions less intimidating as well. And addressing risky situations can take many forms. I've sort of alluded to a couple, but this could include modifying the guide between sessions to rephrase a question or remove a question that seems to elicit a certain response that is unwelcome. You can modify the screener for future efforts, or even dismiss a participant from the study entirely, as I mentioned before. If you're working with a facility, they also have the ability to potentially flag participants who were either not productive in the conversation or potentially threatening and blacklist them from future research. Facilities keep track of that information, so they make sure that they're getting us the best participants possible. In one instance where the participant made a racist and sexist remarks, our moderator determined the conversation was no longer productive for the study, and it was no longer safe for her. So she opted to end the session entirely. And the actions that you take will have different implications depending on your study method. And that's something you'll want to talk about in setting your team guidelines. For example, in that instance I just mentioned, for an IDI, dismissing a participant meant having to replace that person because we still needed that data. And as you can imagine, that would be a little bit different in a focus group, right? Dismissing a participant comes with added complexity because you have to continue that conversation. There are more people in the room. So you'll need to reset the group dynamic and reset the tone of the room. And that can feel a little bit more of a daunting task than ending an IDI, but the benefits definitely outweigh the consequences. Bear in mind that if you feel uncomfortable as the moderator in the room with a focus group and with what someone is saying, it is highly likely that your participants also feel uncomfortable. And that's something you'll have to read the room to figure out. But removing that person could, excuse me, breathe fresh air into the room and help protect the health of your group, yourself, and your data, especially if what the person is saying is detracting from the conversation at hand. Establishing guidelines is important for physical safety as well, as we were talking about with health events. It'll be important to work health and wellness related items potentially into the participant screener, while being mindful, of course, with how health related information is being stored and recorded. But addressing an outbreak in the screener may help participants make a more informed and responsible decision about participating in a study. And researchers can rescreen individuals upon arrival as sort of a rescreening process, just to make sure there are no symptoms to be spread. And I would urge you to be prepared to reschedule or dismiss a participant who shows up sick. If you don't, you're putting yourself and others at risk. And it's also important, talking about these team guidelines, it's important to bring your client into these conversations as early as possible. This can help you set up future conversations that you may need to have with your client, especially if one of these situations does arise and you need to take action. You'll then need to talk with your client about what to do next. So setting up these conversations of what your standards are and what procedures you have in place in case something happens will help better prepare you for those conversations down the road. Once you have a plan in place for what to do, it'll be important to think through how to do it without escalating the situation further. Like some of you were mentioning earlier, fear of escalation. One of the tactics for de-escalating is coming prepared with preset language that you can respond with quickly in a situation that is escalating. Establishing these ahead of time will be an important tool for ensuring the safety of everyone involved. And it could include things like telling a disruptive participant at sign-in that the study was canceled, or mentioning that all quotas were full or that they were otherwise not needed for the study. And the response that you have will depend on the severity of the situation. In the instance that I was just mentioning with a participant that began making the racist remarks, our moderator ended the interview simply by telling the participant that we had reached the end of the discussion. And that was satisfactory for both parties. We got that participant wrapped up and on his way. And as we just discussed, this can be more challenging in a group setting. In a group, expectations are set at the beginning of group conduct, sort of the ground rules of discussion. And in part of that, hopefully your moderator is setting up ground rules for respect among participants and with the people in the room. Setting expectations at the beginning will give you something to measure participant behavior against and will help you anchor your response to any inappropriate behavior. If something starts to happen, you can bring that back up, mention that their behavior is disruptive, and make sure that you warn participants that any continued disrespect will result in dismissal from the group, and be prepared to enforce that rule. Keep in mind that during a focus group, especially, one person can have a large impact on the conversation at hand. And as an additional de-escalation tool, just reassure participants that are being dismissed that they will still be paid for their time. Incentives can be a powerful tool for de-escalation, especially if you're dealing with a participant who is angry or aggressive during a focus group. Dismissing them without an incentive will immediately escalate the situation. Our fifth step is to research in numbers when possible. And oftentimes this is not possible. So I do want to note that I am aware of that. And we need to get creative with how to do this. Having a full team just isn't always feasible especially when you're traveling in the field. But think carefully through situations in which you're going to be alone, either in the field or in IDIs on Zoom or whichever platform you're using. Who knows where you are, what conversations you're having, and what steps are you taking to maintain a support network, both in the moment during data collection and afterwards for a debrief. Will others be observing that you can chat with during the session and help you make decisions? And will others be available afterwards to debrief? Keep in mind that your data collection team could include researchers within the company, could include clients, or even research staff at subcontracted facilities. Just make sure that someone outside of data collection knows where you are, how long you're planning to be there. And you could plan regular check-ins with teams with teams who didn't travel, just to make sure that there's a constant line of communication. And along these same lines, it may also be helpful to connect with researchers outside of your organization. For example, leveraging connections in an organization like UXPA to share ideas and discuss lessons learned with researchers, really chatting through some of these more challenging conversations and what's happened in the past and plans for the future. And just one of our shortest, most to the point steps is document. Document. If something out of the ordinary happens or presents particular risk to you or to others, you should document that situation as soon as possible. A primary benefit of this is, even with quick notes, it may help you process the situation. And these notes can also serve as a reference when recounting the situation to your team back at the office, or if necessary to your HR department, or if necessary, the local authorities. Again, these are varying levels of severity, but those notes will be helpful for you in a variety of ways. And our final step is to debrief. I've mentioned this a little bit a few slides ago, but once the interaction is over, touch base with your research team, which may include your clients, to ensure that everyone is okay, and debrief about the situation, discussing the event that occurred, what actions the team took, what actions the team can take moving forward, just to mitigate any future situations that might occur. And in doing so, will provide you with different perspectives on the situation and can help you make sense of what happened. If any members need to talk further about the situation, again, in a more severe instance, make sure you contact your HR department or even other qualitative researchers in your community for support. They'll be well equipped to lend an ear, and if necessary, earlier I mentioned that participant experiences may echo your own. If something is particularly maybe triggering for you, definitely seek psychological help with that if you're experiencing prolonged distress. I also would encourage you to keep the other involved parties in the loop. So your recruiters and your facility staff. As I was mentioning briefly earlier, they like to stay informed of what's happening and decisions that are getting made with regard to participants, because that can impact how they change and shift to meet needs in the future. And facilities want to know if participants behaved in an unwelcome way so that they can prevent that from happening again. And if you believe that further security measures may be needed, for example, if a participant has made a threat regarding an incentive or is generally aggressive and has seemed like they might come back or something like that, definitely let the individuals at the facility know and alert the authorities. Again, that's a more extreme example. In the instance where our participant made the inappropriate or flirtatious remarks, we were able to work with the facility afterwards to prevent this from reoccurring by simply removing that person from the recruitment panel. It turned out when we talked to them afterwards that participant had also made some uncomfortable and unwelcome remarks to the facility staff as well. So in having that conversation, we were able to help potentially protect them as well in the future. And after data collection is over, I want to underscore, be sure to share your experiences and lessons learned with other researchers. You could help others avoid similar situations in the future. All right, and before we get into Q&A, I want to quickly just underscore and reiterate that instances that we're talking about are rare. And again, the majority of interactions with participants are going to be perfectly pleasant. But again, as researchers, we need to prepare for sort of those most challenging conversations that might occur. And I also want to reiterate that the boundaries that you set for yourself and the boundaries that we all set are going to look different for each person and also for each situation. So it's okay if your tolerance is different from someone else's, and it's okay if yours changes over time. Just make sure that you're continually checking in with yourself to make sure that you're able to draw those firm lines when you need to. And with that, I will open it up to you all. And I should say that if you have questions or questions come up later, or if you generally would just like to talk about this topic more in depth, I'm happy to do that. Please feel free to reach out to me in any capacity. I've included my email here, and I believe my Twitter is also available. So please do feel free to reach out if you have further questions or want to discuss this. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any questions coming in. Again, do feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to talk about this. Oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Someone just mentioned that with regard to rare events, there's a staff professor that mentioned that rare events happen all the time. And I will say that it rings true for me. I mentioned a couple of different instances from this webinar or during this webinar, and each one was a rare instance for a different reason. So thank you for bringing that up, Chauncey. All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Again, please do feel free to reach out if you have further questions. And have a good Veterans Day.